prize coming to you. There's new research coming out that basically the sooner you start worrying about that and thinking about lifestyles that can protect your heart, the better you are. In fact, we're talking early 20s, if not teenage years. Stay tuned to listen more about this fascinating research. Okay, so I am back now, and I brought the man. So Dr. Lloyd-Jones received his MD from Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons, and then guess what? Then he went out and got a master's of science in epidemiology from Harvard. You could kid me. And then he trained here at Mass General Hospital, so he's a Bostonian. But he came back, it was in Chicago, then he came back and he came back to BU, which we are so lucky. But most importantly, he's the big kahuna for the Framingham Heart Study. He leads it. And this is unbelievable. He's going to tell you more about this. But this is, when you talk about heart disease, this is where all the research is. And he's a past president of the American Heart Association. Hello. So, Dr. Lloyd-Jones, thank you so much for coming on Spot On.
Thank you so much, Joan. Thanks for having me. And of course, please call me Don.
Okay.
But I'm really excited. We're going to talk about some great stuff today.
We are. All right. So I live in the burbs and I live, excuse me, a stone's throw from Framingham, Massachusetts. And could you just explain to people what the Framingham Heart Study really is? This is amazing.
Yeah. So the Framingham Heart Study, which, as you said, I now have the honor to lead, is the best known study of heart disease. And in fact, one of the most famous studies based on a population in the world. So coming out of World War II, there was this epidemic of heart disease that was being recognized and was emerging. And there were a lot of reasons for that. More people were smoking. Our diet wasn't particularly good back then, not much better now, but nobody really knew what the underlying causes were of this heart disease epidemic. It had never been studied in great detail. And so in its wisdom, the government created the National Heart Institute as part of NIH, and they directly funded this study to understand the origins and causes of heart disease. There were hypotheses that, maybe blood cholesterol, maybe blood pressure, maybe certain things about our diet, maybe smoking were driving this, but nobody had ever really studied it in a population of people over time to understand whether those things could be contributing to this epidemic. So Framingham was chosen as the site for this because of its proximity to Boston, but also because it had successfully participated as the whole town in a study of tuberculosis a couple decades earlier. So the town was sort of motivated to contribute in this way. What happened then is quite remarkable, that about 20% of the town actually enrolled in this study. And
That's amazing.
and a
Amazing.
number of the people who enrolled were actually families. And the original plan was to study the development of heart disease over the next 20 years. And in fact, that's what happened. We'll talk about what the findings were. But at the end of the 20-year period, the NIH said, well, we think we might be done with this study. At that point, investigators from Boston University, including Dr. William Cannell, Dr. Bill Castelli, really leading lights in this field, said, no, we have more work to do. We need to understand more, follow these same individuals further, but let's now enroll their offspring. And let's understand whether there's a familial transmission of risk for heart disease as well. So in 1971, with renewed funding, now based through Boston University, they enrolled the offspring and the spouses of the offspring of the original group of people. And then that study has continued to this day. So 78 years later, we're still going strong. And we've also enrolled the third generation of individuals.
Wow.
So the grandchildren of the original participants, their spouses, and a couple other groups of people who are more representative of the current makeup of the town of Framingham. So in total, more than 15,000 people from Framingham have been a part of this study. They've been followed for decades to understand what environmental factors, what behaviors, what other things that we can measure about people contribute to the onset of not just heart disease now, but we also look at stroke. We look at cancer, we look at kidney disease, lung disease, all of these sort of chronic diseases of aging. And I think, as we're going to talk about in a second, Framingham is really what put on the map what we now call the risk factors for heart disease.
I mean, this is amazing. Absolutely amazing. You must love this, as a doctor and a researcher, because you got all this data and they keep coming in this generate. Like this is like you won the lottery here.
No doubt about it. And in fact, you mentioned we had been at Boston and we moved to Chicago for a bit, but I actually cut my research teeth at Framingham. I was fortunate enough to be a fellow
Oh,
and started my research career at Framingham, getting incredible mentoring because the investigators at Framingham have been doing this so well for so long. And
oh,
so I feel really blessed to have trained there, gone away, but actually to come back in full circle, be able to lead this study now. It's remarkable. I mean, I'm incredibly proud to to be tapped to do this work, but the real heroes of this study are the participants
yeah.
who,
Oh,
again,
I know.
across generations for 78 years have come in every 2 to 5 years and let us ask, prying questions, measure different things about their body, draw blood, check their blood pressure, sometimes put them on treadmills and make them do stress tests, do a lot of different imaging, all sorts of things that they take pride and they really have passion for doing this because they understand that because of the things we've discovered in Framingham, they have changed the world and they have literally saved the lives of millions of people. What a
And
legacy.
and they've drilled that into their children and to their
Yes.
children's children. And so, for people that don't do research, to have this many people
Yeah.
stay in so long. I mean, always have dropouts from studies and changes, but this is amazing, just absolutely amazing. So,
Yeah.
what we got from this was certain risk factors. So,
Yeah.
certain risk factors. Can you explain what the risk factors were that maybe increase your risk for heart disease?
Yeah. So honestly, it took about 10 years before Framingham could publish its first paper because even though 5,209 people initially enrolled in the study, it just took a while for enough events to occur so that we could actually see the patterns that were emerging. I wasn't alive at the time, but I'll use the we sort of generically. What they found very early on, big signal that things like blood pressure, blood lipid levels, cholesterol particularly,
Mhm.
um, and smoking emerged very quickly as clear things that put one at higher risk for heart events. Um, Over time, they could then start to see that diabetes was a very strong risk factor as well. And shortly thereafter, adverse aspects of our diet and also a sedentary lifestyle. So, really, the big risk factors that we now understand, and of course, weight as well being a risk factor, all those things within the first 15 to 20 years were crystal clear because they have such a strong signal in their relationship to heart disease and different types of heart disease.
You,
One
you
thing,
know,
Joan, if I might, just to say
oh,
about Framingham that's also special from the beginning, and with each successive group of people that we've enrolled there, we've always enrolled more women than men, always.
mm,
And
right.
that, even to this day, that is unusual in medical research. What's fascinating about the early papers, if you go back and read the early papers from Framingham from 1957, 58, 1961, what they saw was what we now know to be, typically true. That is that in younger ages and in middle age, more men tend to develop heart disease earlier than women. Not that women don't, but they just tend to develop it a little bit later. And they described this, that in middle age, more men were getting it than women. By older age, women were starting to catch up. But they also made a really important observation, and that is there's something different
Mm,
about the way heart disease presents in women. The symptoms are different, the manifestations are different, and they instantly, even back in 1957 said we need to study this more. It took the scientific community decades to really take that seriously and catch up. But I'm really proud again of Framingham sort of understanding this early on and calling out we can't just think that men or women are the same because they're not.
You're so spot on because, when I was training in dietetics early on, we just worried about men and heart disease, women, breast cancer. Oh, we were worried about, and then we learned over time that postmenopausal women, like you just said, are back up high risk of heart disease. And I'm so glad that you're looking into the differences because that is number one cause of death among postmenopausal women is heart disease. And so
Right.
we got to stay on top of that. Okay, now you put out a brand study, but this is the one where I read this, and we're going to put this on the Spot on Facebook page for people to read. But I read this and said, "What?" So, you think heart disease. Okay, you have to ring and say, "Okay, so well, to try to do good things, I'm going to worry about that in my 50s." And then you come along, and with this paper, it's called Cardiovascular Health Changes in Young Adults and Risk of Later Life Heart Disease. And what did you show? Because I'm like speechless.
Yeah. Well, I think we ask this question because we understand now that cardiovascular disease, that is things that affect our heart and our arteries, um, it's a life course disease. So, we think about plaques forming inside the arteries. Those plaques can grow over time. The plaques are made up of cholesterol and other elements that ultimately can block an artery, and can do so actually on the spur of the moment. It's not like a slow growing process when a heart attack occurs. It's a slow growing process that suddenly transforms into a completely blocked artery.
Hmm.
So that plaque formation though starts in children and accelerates through young adulthood and then manifests most commonly in our 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Some people earlier for sure, but for most people, they have the heart attack or the stroke in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. By the time you get to those ages, we know we can't put the horse back in the barn. If you've already got a lot of plaque, we've got things that can reduce your risk, but we can't restore low risk. And so pretty clearly we have to start further upstream. And that was the nature of this question was, does it matter what young adults are doing in their 20s and 30s in terms of their cardiovascular health status? And if it does, what are the things that they should really focus on maintaining at high levels or improving so that they can avoid later life events?
And so, what did you find out?
Yeah. So what we found was we used a study called the Cardia study, which is just like the Framingham study. It's a little bit later in terms of its when it enrolled people, but it enrolled people at the ages of 18 to 30. So about 5,000 young men and women, half of whom were Black, half of whom were white, half men, half women. Um, and it's now followed them for about 40 years. And what we saw there was when we accounted for something called their Life's Essential Aids score, which is a way to measure their cardiovascular health, we found that there were about kind of four different groups of people. There were people who had high cardiovascular health, that's good, in early adulthood, and they
Mhm.
maintained that. And then there were some kind of two groups in the middle, and then there was a group that had low cardiovascular health to start with, and it only declined. So those four different groups of people acted very differently, which is to say that after age 40, when we looked at who had heart attacks and strokes, the people with high cardiovascular health through young adulthood, very rare. The people with low cardiovascular health in young adulthood, 10 times more likely to have a heart attack in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it really mattered what was happening upstream in the 20s and 30s in terms of what the ultimate outcomes were for those people. And I know we're going to get into the details of what does that mean, what is the life essential eight, and how can I maintain my high cardiovascular health. But I think what was striking for us was that not only sort of where you started, but if you could improve your cardiovascular health, you could dramatically reduce your risk for those later life events. And I think that's what's really good news here is that this is within people's power.
That's right. And okay, if maybe you're 40 right now, it's still good to start. If you're 20, it's real good to start. And I want to tell you something because after I read your paper and then invited you to come on to this podcast, guess what gets released this week
There you
is
go.
the 2026 dietary guidance from the American Heart Association. So I'm reading this and I look at this, look, I highlighted it, okay? And it says that consume heart healthy diet patterns across the life cycle. And it goes on to say what you just said. And I'm like, I knew that. I knew that because I read the other paper. Okay. And for once, I love when I know something before people know something. But I am so excited. So now this is what I talk about because, as I teach nutrition at Boston University, it's osteoporosis. I'll worry about that when I get there. Heart disease, you're not waiting. You're waiting. You got to take care of it now. And what I find, Don, is that, I teach non-majors and these students, they're getting worried about, I mean, they're concerned. They are aware now. They see their grandparents. They want to do better than the grandparents, live longer, but live better, not just
Yeah.
longer, because we can keep them living, but live better. And so they're really into this. So I wanted to get out how important this was to look at these what you studied as risk factors and how to reduce them. The earlier, the better for a better outcome later in life. And the American Heart Association has something called the Life Essentials 8. And so, and if anybody who's watching this on YouTube, you see the 8, that's a pin, right? Okay.
It is.
And he promised to send me one, but we'll see if that comes my way.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there were 8 things that you want to do. And the first one, of course, is eat better. That's like my world. Okay, this is everything. I always say that of the leading causes of death among Americans: heart disease, certain cancer, stroke, diabetes. You can fight them with a fork and a knife.
Yep.
Okay, and so when I saw the eat better came first, and so give us a little bit about what this means. About when you say eat better, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, let me back up for 1 second, just from 10,000. What is Life's Essential Eight? Why do we need this score from the American Heart Association? We can talk about your future risk of heart disease and stroke like we've been talking about, but how do people measure their health today? I think that's actually much more relevant, especially for a young person, right? Because they don't yet have usually high blood pressure or high cholesterol or diabetes. So how can they track their health status today and be assured that that's going to have good long-term outcomes for them? And that's really what the Life's Essential 8 construct and score are designed to do. And so it is made up of these 8 metrics: eat healthier, be more physically active, get good quality sleep, and avoid nicotine in all forms. And then know your numbers. What's your body mass index? That is your weight index to your height. What's your blood pressure? What's your blood sugar? And what are your blood cholesterol numbers? And again, those things you won't know unless you directly measure them and talk to your doctor about them. So those are the 8 things. And they are all interrelated, but just knowing what the score is on those, you can actually calculate your cardiovascular health status today, and it will be associated with your long-term outcomes. There's a
And,
great website from the American Heart Association. If you Google My Life Check, or if you Google Life's Essential 8, you'll get right there. You can do your score within 5 minutes.
Thank you for summarizing this because, by the way, I get so excited. I go right to the diet because I think the diet is everything. So,
Understandable.
all right. So, what you corrected me. Okay, it's 8. Okay, Joan, stop. All right. So, what is eat when you say eat
Yeah.
better? I mean, I
Yeah.
know what that is, but help them. What is eat better? What do you mean?
Yeah, you know this well. And the truth is, while I think there's a lot of noise these days about what a healthy eating pattern looks like, there's not really much disagreement about what a healthy eating pattern looks like, right? It starts with lots of fruits and vegetables. It must start with that. It also starts with trying to minimize the simple carbohydrates, the simple sugars, like avoiding white flour and sugar sweetened beverages and things like that. And any carbohydrates that you are getting, try to make them as whole grain as possible.
Right. And
Um,
whole fruits and vegetables, right? Right.
Absolutely. Yep. Whole fruits and vegetables rather than processed or juiced fruits and vegetables would be ideal for sure. Um, and protein, a really important part of the diet for sure, but the protein should be as lean as possible. So things like chicken and fish are better choices
Right.
than red meats and processed meats. No question about it. And then, around the edges, there are very healthy things about fat. Nuts and seeds contain healthy fats. When we're cooking, we should use healthier fats. So things like canola oil, which for whatever reason seems to have gotten a bad rap, but it's actually a pretty healthy way to cook. if you're having raw oil, olive oils are really healthy fat and should be part of your, what you're consuming. So again, starting with a plate that's filling up with whole fruits and vegetables, lean protein, whole grain carbohydrates are okay.
Hmm.
And filling around the edges with nuts and seeds for your snacks. That's a really, really healthy way to eat and to think about organizing your life.
I'm so glad you talked about the oils because the vegetable oils are very healthy, and you want to get the saturated fat down in your diet, and the vegetable oils are higher in the unsaturated. So soybean oil, canola, you said olive oil, not beef tallow. No, 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 not no,
Please not
no,
beef
no.
tallow.
You
Please.
see what the man said? Please not beef tallow. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's go to those vegetable oils. Okay,
Yeah.
being more active, I think we know that we need to be more active. And my goodness, with Netflix, you could binge watch for days and get off the couch. So when your activity, we did a whole podcast, you'll love this episode on walking, which is great. So more movement. And the take home is that it's cumulative. Like you don't have to do like an hour a day, in one club.
Right. No, that's right. So I think the mantra about physical activity is if you're doing nothing, do something. If you're doing
Mhm.
something, do more.
Right.
Because there's gain for every minute of activity that you do.
Right.
Now, the biggest gain does come from getting off the couch and just doing 10 minutes per week. Like that's where the steepest improvement in health comes. And above that, you still get more and more gain that sort of tops out around 150 minutes a week of moderate to
Okay.
vigorous activity. Now, that can be a brisk walk. It could be swimming. It could be biking. It could be something more intensive like jogging or running, something more competitive. But just doing something is where you
Right.
really, really get the benefit. So
Right.
simple walking doesn't have to be all at once. You can do it in 10-minute chunks.
Mhm.
And just do it,
Okay.
and whatever you enjoy is the most
Right.
important answer. Yeah.
Maybe like less Ubers and more walking, if it's
There you
safe and
go.
everything. If you're like, there we go. All right. Now, this one I'm going to pick your brain about because this is interesting. I know tobacco, smoking and heart health. And but you talk about that, but I'm going to ask you know what I'm going to ask you. What's with the vaping?
Yeah. Well, so we know combusting anything and breathing it into your lungs is a really bad idea for your health, right? Particularly true of combustible cigarettes, because of all the other things that are in cigarette smoke that are hugely bad for our lungs. And the first thing downstream from our lungs is our heart and our heart arteries. So really tough on the heart. Um, but you're right, vaping is touted as a safer way to do this. And for sure, it doesn't usually have all the bad things we see in cigarette smoke. However, what you think is in your vape is not the only thing that's in your vape. There are plenty
Hmm.
of other chemicals that we know also damage the lungs, also damage the heart. And too often, vaping is used as a way to get young people hooked on nicotine. Nicotine, one of the most highly addictive substances known to man, it changes the chemical structure of your brain and gets you hooked for life. So avoiding nicotine in all its forms, including vaping is really crucial. Don't even start because again, then it creates that dependency on nicotine. And nicotine itself actually is harmful to the body. But the real harm, of course, is the addiction, and that someday that you may combine it with combustible cigarette use and or the other chemicals in the vape and cause damage to your body.
I read an interesting statistic on the CDC. 7 in 10 high school students reported being exposed to e-cigarette vaping marketing. So, you and I are old. We'd had the Marlboro Man, and everything. But that was unbelievable to me. And they think it's vaping. It's not smoking. I'm not smoking, and
Right.
that's why I think that's important that we get out that it's not just, oh, I'm just vaping. There's problems going
Yeah.
on there.
Well,
Oh,
and I would say we've seen this playbook before, right?
yes.
That
Yes.
big tobacco, big food, big soda, they know exactly how to market this so that they will get people hooked on their product
Hmm.
and then they'll keep them hooked and that's how they make money. They
That's right.
they they don't care about your health. They care
Right.
about making money and making money from you. And that's, I
Yes.
think, the message that too few young people are getting.
Right. And that was a bad movie. That was a bad movie that we had to watch. Okay, getting sleep. That's what I thought. That's what I thought was interesting because you always hear you need to get more sleep. But tell me about what's the story with sleep and your heart disease?
Yeah. So just a bit of background, we when we initially created the construct of cardiovascular health in 2010, there were only seven metrics, and sleep was not one of them. The other seven were. We thought about sleep, but at the time we couldn't measure it very objectively. Now thanks to things like this, we can. And also, we just didn't have the scientific base to say what about sleep and how much is enough and things like that. By the time we redid this and created Life Essential 8 in 2022, the data were there, and we could kind of confidently point to an objective measure of sleep that if you are getting as an adult 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, that is really the optimal sweet spot. It's
Hmm.
sort of like Goldilocks. Above that, actually, health tends to decline a little bit if you're sleeping more than 9 hours per night. Below 7 hours and sharply, as you go down, it declines sharply. You really need more to optimize your health because sleep is so central to what happens to your blood pressure,
Right.
what happens to your ability to handle sugar, and what happens to your blood pressure spikes, excuse me, blood sugar spikes after you eat something. It's directly related to your ability to maintain weight. It affects
Yes.
your appetite. All these things are interconnected. So sleep is really foundational to many other aspects of cardiovascular health. And consistently getting that 7 to 9 hours per night is really one of the best ways that you can keep yourself healthy.
I read that over a third of adults in the United States don't get the recommended sleep, but a higher percentage of high school students don't get it.
Yeah.
So it's really, again, a bad habit to start early in life. Shut off the computer and go to bed.
Yeah.
Cholesterol, but the cholesterol, watching your cholesterol, that was something that came out of the Framingham Heart Study. So we guess getting that monitored. And what age should you start looking at getting your blood work done? And
Mhm. Mhm. So, would you believe it if I told you that for children who have a strong family history of early heart disease or a family history that's known of something called familial hypercholesterolemia, we should screen them at age two?
oh, wow.
Two, right? For all children, they should be screened at ages 9 to 11. And for sure, anybody by age 21 should have had a complete lipid panel done. So that's the very, very latest that you should have your first cholesterol test. But ideally, ages 9 to 11 are when the vast majority of people should be initially screened.
I just want to tell you something that, when I was trained in school, it was 20. It was age 20.
Yeah,
I didn't realize it has gone down to, oh my goodness, I'm
yeah.
putting notes here. Okay, let's go. Blood sugar. We've done episodes on diabetes and pre-diabetes, and I probably have to redo them because the numbers have increased. And I
Mhm.
checked out that more than 40 million Americans have diabetes, but everybody just take a breath. 115 million Americans have pre-diabetes. I, I, I don't know what to say. And
Yeah.
pre-diabetes, I always say you're on deck to get diabetes. You don't do something about it. But that number has just inflated in just short time.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
No, it is stunning. Now more than 10% of Americans have diabetes diagnosed. Another 3% or so have diabetes, but it is not yet diagnosed. And
Yeah.
so, that's a ticking time bomb that people need to make sure they get the numbers measured so that they'll find out as soon as possible. But as you said, we've got a huge pipeline of people who are going to become diabetes, just within years to a decade, because they already have prediabetes, and it tends to be kind of inexorably progressive unless you intervene and lose.
Right.
Typically, losing weight is the best
Hmm.
way to kind of arrest that and maybe even reverse it. Um, and it honestly, we'll talk about weight, I know, but it honestly does not take a drastic amount of weight loss to
No,
control
I
your
know.
blood sugar. Only about 5 or 10% of your body weight, and you'll have a really, really nice impact on your blood sugar, on your blood pressure too, by the way. So this is something that, while it is really hard, it is very important to focus on this because the ravages of diabetes, I think, will be well known to many of your listeners. And not only do you need to take a lot of medications, you need a lot of medical monitoring. And if it's not well controlled, it can lead to amputations, blindness, kidney problems, dialysis, and of course, heart disease and stroke. Not something you want to mess with if you don't have to.
No, no. When I had a private practice for years, and I specialized in weight management, and helping people lose weight. And of course, they always come if they're, increased body fat, especially around the middle, have high cholesterol and high blood pressure. So I used to say, well, let's just, try to lose a little bit of weight. And they would lose a little bit of weight. And I say, let's take your blood pressure now. And it would go down. And
Yeah.
they thought I was like this magical person. Okay. But so don't tell anybody this. So I said, oh, it was nothing. This happens all the time. All right. You know what I mean? So they thought I was terrific. It's true that if just a little bit of weight loss will lower the blood pressure, the cholesterol. And speaking about body weight, let's end with body weight. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, so this is really the story of the United States since 1985. We've seen less than 10% of our population being obese, defined as a body mass index over 30. Now, as you said, 40% of Americans are obese, and another 40% are overweight. So they are on the
Right.
journey to becoming obese
Right.
typically.
Mhm.
Just a dramatic, like we've never seen an epidemic in human history of a chronic condition like this ever before. We're now the heaviest nation that has ever existed. And that has real consequences for our health. As you said, in our blood sugar, in our blood pressure, in our lipids, and by the way, disrupting our sleep, of course, as well. And you know, I think too often we stigmatize obesity and put this on the individual. We have built the society that created this,
Oh, yeah.
we can't put this on individuals. We put this on an unhealthy food supply, a society that requires people to work two jobs and work night shifts, which really disrupts all the other aspects of their health and, doesn't allow people to have a living wage. So they are forced
Mhm.
to choose high caloric, low
Right.
quality foods just to kind of keep them and their kids, functioning. This is a policy problem more than it's an
Right.
individual problem by a
Right.
lot.
Right.
And I hate to see the stigmatization that happens around obesity because we need to help people avoid this in the first place.
You know, hashtag it takes a village. And the
Yeah.
village has to come from policies to improve the villages, the surroundings, everything together. That's a whole nother podcast
Yeah.
episode that we could talk about. But I was fascinated about this study that you did. I'm thankful that you did it to get the message out about let's start sooner than later. And now with, we're talking children, let's start now. Again, whenever you start is good, but the earlier you can start, the better. And let's not wait. And so I'm hoping the whole idea of having you on here was to get that message out after you published this fabulous paper. So I can't thank you enough. I'm glad, I'm glad you moved, but I'm glad you came back. Okay, because Chicago's nice, but Boston is lovely. So
There
I'm
you go.
so excited that you're here and that you're heading this and you stay with the American Heart Association. And I'm waiting for the pin in the mail. Okay, so with Dr. Don Jones, he's laughing at me now. I can't thank you so much for being on Spot On.
Well, listen, Joan, thank you for what you're doing because you're getting the message out to people at the time when they need it and when they can act on it. And I can write all the papers in the world, but if nobody hears about them, it's not doing anybody any good. So I really appreciate your amplifying these critically important messages, and your listeners are, they're blessed to have you. So thank you.
Well, listen, you keep writing the papers and I'll keep talking, okay? Does
There we
that
go.
sound good? Okay,
Sounds good.
okay,
Yeah,
good. Thank you so much.
you bet.